So hello, welcome back to Triratna Local Library, and so I'm going to give a short talk about the mind precepts, and in a way it's quite a practical talk. It's sort of, in a way, the pith teachings from Vajratara, having explored the mind precepts over the years, and I was particularly reflecting on this on a solitary retreat I was on. I've just come back from a solitary retreat, so really looking at what the mind precepts are in practice. And there's a lovely quote actually from a Christian mystic tradition where they talk about watching the mind as a skilled fisherman watches for fish. The Buddha himself uses different images. He says it's like being a cow herdsman and watching the cows, making sure they don't stray into the wrong fields and they eat the right pastures. Actually, I neither fish nor farm, but I kind of get that idea, that you're taking care of something. You're like a good friend to your own mind. I think that's really what appamada means. One word for the word mindfulness or heedfulness is being a good friend to the mind and steering it in the right direction, watching where it's going, and sort of looking after it in a particular way. So yes, and the Buddha talked about how he watched his mind before even his own enlightenment, when he talked about it in the Two Kinds of Thought Sutta. So I think if you were interested, I think it's really worth reading that sutra if you haven't already. It's in the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle length sayings. So what I'm going to talk about is what attitude we need to have to watching the mind, and what we'll find when we're watching the mind, and what to confess and what not to confess. I've been very pleased to see how many of the talks actually have focused on confession, because it's such an important practice, and hopefully something that you're doing in some context at the moment, maybe with your preceptor or with other friends. So I'll start with right attitude. And Yeshe Sogyal, who's the disciple of one of the disciples of Padmasambhava, talks about this. He says, rely on these words that you have asked for. Draw reverence and humility from your very bones. So yes, we're relying on these words that we've asked for. We've taken on ourselves to undertake the journey of the exploration of the mind. In a way, one could see that as what Buddhism does. There's other kind of sciences or traditions or skills where you go and look at the external world and find out about that. But within Buddhism, we're very much looking at our mind and the interactions that our mind gives rise to. And we can see, pretty early on in our Buddhist practice, we can see how our mind creates our reality, creates our experiences, whether that's happiness or suffering. You'll particularly see that if you're on a retreat and something will come into your mind, and you create your own heaven and you create your own hell within a day, or you create whatever realm you end up in. Just by having certain thoughts. It doesn't necessarily mean anything's happened, but just by thinking certain things. And we also see the potential of our mind. So it's very important when Yeshe Sogyal says, draw reverence and humility from your very bones. We're also drawing reverence from our very bones. And this is reverence partly to the capacity and potential of consciousness. Which is embodied in the form of the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, the ideal of Buddhahood, where we glimpse what lies beyond our current state of consciousness. I think if we didn't really have a glimpse of that, we wouldn't be nearing this point of ordination. So yes, one of the things that the Buddha says, he says, luminous, O monks, is the mind, and it is defiled by adventitious defilements. So we can get a glimpse of the potential of mind as being luminous, as being vast, as being having the capacity for limitless energy, limitless wisdom, limitless compassion. when Bhante talks about the kind of potential of the mind, he talks about infinite creativity, which is a very beautiful way of looking what's possible at our mind. And I think that's worth really taking seriously, that within examining our minds in terms of the precepts, we're also aware of the capacity of the mind, that it, in a way that, it's this mind that will gain enlightenment. And as Lama Govinda says, which Bhante quotes in the survey, he says, latent within every sphere of consciousness is the potential for Buddhahood. So latent within this sphere of consciousness is the potential for Buddhahood. There is this capacity of human consciousness that can break through delusion and that can see reality as it actually is. And how wonderful that we're preparing the conditions for that within our own practice. Actually, it was very good. Dana Utah put me on to the introduction that Bhante gave to living ethically, which I thought, wow, this is really good. I can't remember listening to this before, and then I remembered I was actually there, but clearly it had gone into a file in the back of my mind. And he talks about ethics there as imagination, and he talks about imagination as the opening of the Divya Shakshu, the divine mind, the mind even of the Devas, where you start to see the sort of symbolic resonance of things. And I really love this image of spiritual development as opening these different eyes. You've got your fleshy eye, you've got the divine eye, you've got the Buddha eye, you've got the all-seeing eye. It's like you're seeing further and further, or deeper and deeper into the heart of things. So it's very, very exciting. The capacity of the spiral path, unfolding positive emotion, which is not so far away. It's possible for all of us. So as much as we've got the potential for the great capacity of the mind, we've also got potential, as we know, of utter stupidity and delusion. So we have to take this journey of looking at our mind with humility and humour. I think having a good earthy sense of humour helps in these matters, because we've got to not be afraid to get our hands dirty and look right into the heart of our own mind. Dana Utah as well, she quoted the survey of saying that we proclaim from the rooftops what happens in the secret and silent chambers of our own heart. So we've got to get back from the rooftops into what's actually happening in our heart with any action. And that is quite an undertaking, actually, to dig that deep into our own minds, looking at it in terms of ethics. And I have noticed that there's a temptation with particularly people who are about to get ordained to be very good and to put on their best behaviour to prove that they're worthy for ordination. I think I probably did this. I remember when I was coming as a satellite team member at Triratna Loka, and I wasn't ordained that long, but I was coming here to help out the team, and just before I did that, I had this retreat here where we did the Transcendental Principle, and I always seem to have some sort of traumatic life event just before a Transcendental Principle retreat. So on this occasion, I just split up with a long-term relationship, and I came on retreat here to do the Transcendental Principle retreat, and it was not my best side. And I was thinking, they're just not going to want me to come and help out the team. I'm a mess, But in a way, that's exactly what you want to see, because if someone tries to put on their best side, you just can't reach them. You don't know what's going on. It's slightly weird. I definitely feel myself, if I'm trying to put on my best side, what I become is slightly weird and annoying. So that's not what we're dealing with. That's not what spiritual friendship is about. Spiritual friendship is about coming from the best of ourselves, yes, but also seeing the full picture, having that kind of honest, open exploration of the mind. And it's not about being good, as Subhadra Mati gave as the title of her book. So yes, the spiritual life in the end is about going from the general truths to the specific. It's about going from dharmic truths into our own particular application of those dharmic truths in our lives, and looking what is actually happening and knowing how to work with that. I think as order members you give a lot of confidence if you're able to see what's happening in your own mind and know how to work with that. Not just having an abstract notion of an ideal and then trying to fit it. So Bhante talks about this in the Milarepa seminars. He talks about how the kind of capability of human consciousness is that we can have an abstract ideal, like Buddhahood, and then we can move towards that ideal. We can have in mind who we want to be and where we want to go. But of course the difficulty with that is that we can separate out our actual experience from our ideal. So we think that where we want to go is where we actually are. And we can lose sight of what's actually happening in our own lives. So yes, we can be aware of the capacity or potential of Buddhahood as represented by the Buddha himself. But then we also need to be aware of where we are in relation to that, and you know that there's a bit of work to do to get there, and how the ideal is actually playing out in our own lives. So the mind precepts, the attitude of the mind precepts is to hold both the vision and the transformation and the reality itself of the mind. And I think this is what I particularly get from solitary retreats. I remember someone asked me, well, what do you hope to gain from a solitary retreat? And I said it's a deeper understanding of my own mind, and an ability to work with my own mind, and a strengthening of going for refuge. So seeing clearly into my own mind and strengthening my going for refuge. And that, of course, is the basis of real communication with people when I return from solitary, is if I can see what's happening in my own mind and I've strengthened my going for refuge, then there's the basis for a real mutual responsiveness, a real communication. Because you can't communicate with an abstract notion of an ideal. It's like communicating with a book. You can only communicate fully with the reality of someone's lived experience and how they're living that ideal reality in their own mind. So that's what I hope to do, is to be able to be real about my experience and communicate on the basis of that. So what you'll find in this exploration of mind is the movements of the mind, that the mind is constantly shifting, awareness is constantly shifting. As we know from the two kinds of thought sutta and the beginning of the Dharmapada, if our mind can move into skillful directions, it can lead us away from difficulties towards nibbana, towards wisdom, to the well-being of ourselves and others, and it can move away from those things. It can move into unskillful directions, into difficulty, into not having welfare for ourselves and others, and further away from nibbana. So let's have a little look at those. In terms of the unskillful movements of mind, they come mainly into the movement to grasp, the movement of aversion, and the movement of ignorance, sort of staying still. So the movement towards is craving and desire for appropriation, grasping. So what Dharmadinna of the Pali Canon says also in the Majjhima Nikaya, when she talks about this in a very interesting way. She said there's a latent tendency within pleasant experience to lead to craving and this desire for appropriation. So I really saw this in my own solitary retreat, with where my mind is like, where's the next pleasure coming from? For me it's usually food, or even in meditation, actually, where is my next pleasure coming from? What will I enjoy next doing? or going for a walk or whatever it is. What's the weather doing? Am I going to enjoy it or not? Where's the pleasure coming from? And how can I extend and appropriate that pleasure? So I don't know about you, but I've got this thing. Sometimes I don't always enjoy solitaries that much, and I can find myself sort of fantasizing about the perfect place for a solitary. And I'm thinking, well, this is weird because you're not particularly enjoying this particular moment, but what you're doing is you're fantasizing about how to make it better. You know, what the perfect place for this solitary would be, and where it would be, and imagine, you know, there's a particular field near Triratna. Imagine, if there's an old kind of ruin of a barn, and if we could we could make that into a really nice kuti, and that would be great. And before I know, I've got a whole scenario of a fantasy about what this next solitary, this perfect solitary, is going to be like, forgetting about this solitary I'm actually having and this experience that I'm actually having. So yes, there's a desire with pleasure also, you know, that we enjoy something, that we want to continue it, we want to appropriate it, we want it to be our continued experience. But pleasure doesn't always have to lead to craving. It's if you're philosophical, it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition for craving. So this is also what Dharma Dinner talks about. She says sometimes we can have pleasure without craving. So particularly in meditation, you can experience a kind of release of craving, which is itself pleasurable. You don't want anything else other than the experience that you're having. You're quite content to be there. There's no compulsion for the next big experience. You're just there with the breath, with the mind, with an open heart, in a little sweet spot that is utterly exquisite, and you don't need anything else. And that can deepen so that the pleasure starts to arise from within, suffusing the whole body, but without any kind of external stimulus, whether you're hot or cold or whatever. So we can have a kind of pleasure that leads to simplicity and contentment, that leads to letting go of further craving, that can indeed lead to complete bliss. So one of the things that Bhante talks about, he says, well, shunyata is the objective, in a way that is reality as expressed as the object, because we think in terms of subject and object. When we think about reality, we've got the objective pole of reality, which is shunyata, but he said subjectively its reality is expressed as bliss. So the subjective counterpart to shunyata, if you can talk about it like that, even though the experience of shunyata goes beyond subject and object, how we actually experience it is bliss. That's the subjective counterpart of insight and of an experience of shunyata. So yes, we can have this upwelling bliss coming from within, and it really is wonderful, wonderful. We can also experience it as the pleasures of the spiritual life, you know, meditation, friendship, communication, work as practice. All these things can be pleasurable and lead us further into simplicity. So that's the kind of skillful side of it. Of course, the other unskillful movement of the mind is aversion, and away from. So we experience something as painful, and that has a latent tendency to aversion. And sometimes, you know, it can be quite comical. It's a bit like, I just find this with it. I don't often have a bath, but sometimes I think I'm really going to have a bath, and quite often it's not quite the right temperature, and I get in and it's like, oh, you know, the dukkha of a tepid bath, or you know, the dukkha of a meal that doesn't quite go right. So sometimes it's quite light-hearted, but there's also a serious edge to it. There's also the serious edge of coming up against illness and death and aging, where we experience dukkha and we have an aversion to it. We have aversion to other people who get in our way, get in between what we want and what we can actually get. It can lead to real frustration. So yes, there's a sort of cycle of aversion that starts with frustrated desire and kind of builds up to anger, which then finds an object of blame and then becomes hatred and rage. So it sort of feeds on itself, this cycle of aversion. But where it starts is frustrated desire. Where it starts is painful experience. And it can be very painful to experience, and also I think it can have an effect on other people. I've experienced that. A deep concern of mine is that if I have ill will to someone else, it will actually affect them as well. So it's a very, very painful state to be in. But luckily, according to Dharma, painful experience does not always have to have the latent, it doesn't always have to lead to aversion. And she says this very beautifully. She said, well, you can have the kind of longing and grief that arises when we realize we're not enlightened. Why am I not one of the noble ones? Leads to a longing to be a noble one, longing to be an arahant, longing for liberation and awakening, and the grief that we're not there yet. The grief that we feel separate from the world, the grief that is living as a deluded being in an existence itself. We've also got other examples of this which are painfully felt but spiritually very positive. Free in apatrapya, when we realise that we have a longing to be skillful and our actions don't quite match up to our longing to be skillful. These are all kind of dukkhas of the path. They're spiritually positive. They lead us towards awakening. But they're very painful to experience. There's a shadow across the heart. And sometimes we need to go back to the frustrated desire itself. Frustrated desire that might give rise to anger, but also that frustrated desire which is quite sweet. It's like a lot of the frustrated desire, when you get back to it itself, is quite positive. It's a longing for connection, or it's a longing to be free. It's a longing to feel peace with the world. So yes, Pema Chodron talks about getting to the soft spot beneath the hard emotion. What's the real frustrated desire? And sometimes it's universal. Sometimes if you can get to that frustrated desire itself, that longing, it can actually help you connect further and deeper with other people, rather than making us feel distant from others. So we've also got the movement of the mind, which is kind of sinking. And this is the neutral feeling, which Dharmadina says has a latent tendency towards ignorance. So yes, I think a lot of this means that neutral feeling is actually just when you're not very in touch with your feelings. If you think something's neutral and then you investigate it, you actually find there is a lot of feeling there. It's just you weren't aware of it. And ignorance is not just being sort of unaware of one's feelings or of reality or whatever. There's also a kind of slightly conscious choice not to be aware. There's a movement into the fog. Sometimes I talk about this with Karen Adi. It's like the fog descends, or we let ourselves just sink into that fog. Bhante talks about ignorance as alienation. It's a very big theme, actually, alienated awareness for Bhante. And he talks about that ignorance as just not being in touch with our feelings, and having an abstract ideal but having no feeling for it, being alienated from that, living life in abstract thought rather than lived feelings. And the main wrong view, ethically speaking, so this is also about delusion, it's about ignorance. The main wrong view that it's about, according to the Buddha, ethically speaking, is not believing that a higher spiritual life is possible, and that there's no higher consciousness than what we're experiencing now. And I think this is the one we've really got to watch for. There's many, many, many wrong views that we hold. But the most damaging is a lack of faith, actually. a feeling where life is meaningless and there's nowhere further to go. It's so painful to be in. We've lost the emotional world of higher spiritual reality. So we've made the higher spiritual realities an abstract ideal, and then we've distanced ourselves from it. We're no longer in connection with it. We've lost, if you like, our dharmic responsiveness. I think I personally had dharmic responsiveness even as a child, and I don't think I'm unusual for that. I always had a sense of a higher spiritual reality that's possible, and of course it becomes overlaid with skepticism. I've really had to resist that, overlaid by the kind of harsh realities of the world. But actually kind of going back to that childhood experience, I think I felt it, in many ways. I felt that there was meaning in this world and that there was a possibility of a higher spiritual consciousness. So Dharmadinna says that it doesn't always have to lead to ignorance, because neutral feeling can be experienced in the fourth dhyana and in states of equanimity and peace. So peace doesn't have a very strong, pleasant or painful feeling, but there's a vibrancy to it in itself. I think peace is quite a hard ideal to come to terms with. It can seem a bit limp or lifeless. Equanimity can seem a bit lifeless. But we can really love it as its own spiritual quality, as peace, as having its own vibrancy from its own side, rather than looking for the next big experience. We're sold by advertising companies to look for the next big experience, but actually there is something we're not sold, and we're not sold on peace. I think we have to find, as the Buddha said, find peace within yourself, and really learn to love that peace, to relish that peace, to drink in that peace, as what's called in the Therigatha actually is the it's sort of eternal elixir of life. That's what peace is. It's an elixir of life, strength-giving sort of elixir. So what do we confess? I think the first thing is to make sure that we're specific in our confession, because the roots of greed, hatred and delusion are deep. Well, the non-enlightened mind is deep. We've been doing it for aeons, lifetimes upon lifetimes. So we can't just kind of confess craving or hatred or aversion, or even indifference, in ignorance in a kind of grand sense, because we'll keep doing it. It doesn't really make sense. That's what our mind's doing all the time. I think it takes years of practice to see how deeply deluded we are and the depth of that without feeling guilt. I actually feel quite happy when I find it. Sometimes I find it on solitaries. I think, oh yeah, this is it. Basically, it's me first. I can be as nice as I like, but basically when it comes down to it, it's me first. And when I experience that on solitaries, I feel quite a relief, because I think, right, now I know what I'm dealing with. Let's forget all the superficial stuff. That's what I'm dealing with. It's my utter and complete selfishness. And strangely, that puts me in quite a good mood. But I think that's taken me a while to get there. What we have to do in terms of confessions is look at the expressions of greed, hatred and delusion. And in the two kinds of thought sutta, the Buddha talks about how he noticed them as they arose. He noticed the greed manifest, he noticed hatred manifested, he noticed the specific instances as they arose, and he considered, is this leading me towards enlightenment or is it not? If it is, then I can cultivate it without grasping that particular state of mind, and if it isn't, then I can abandon it. So maybe you have to start with the body and speech precepts. Maybe we start with those external expressions from the rooftops, and then dig deeper down into the mind. Dharmadinna of our own order talked about it as pulling the hair from the plug hole. You start with one little strand and then you come out with a whole clump. I think in a way what it's showing is there's very subtle connections with body, speech and mind. They're not three things, that actually all part of a kind of network of expression. And what you do with the mind will be expressed in action, and what you do with your body will be expressed in the mind. They're sheaves, and you can really see this in lockdown. I think a lot of people have felt that it sort of flushed something out of their mind. It's deep habits that we thought we'd conquered long ago have resurfaced as we become under mental stress. Patterns around eating, patterns of craving start playing out. As we're locked in and we don't do what we need to with our bodies, then we can also find that affects our mind. So it's kind of looking at those expressions and seeing that, this is expressed in us personally, but it is also the nature of human experience. And the most important thing, I think, is to distinguish between karma and viparka. So karma is action, and viparka is the fruits of action. So a lot of what happens in our mind is the fruits of previous actions. It's viparka. The perceptual situation, according to Buddhism, is viparka. So mind is one of the sense objects. So just as we see things and then eye consciousness arises, so we think things. Mind consciousness arises. Thoughts as mind objects, as objects of mind consciousness. So we're thinking all the time, basically, and we're thinking all the time, and that's not necessarily karmically active. It's what our mind does, and what we think, our samnya, even our sanskaras, our habits, our mental habits, to a certain extent, are conditioned by previous experience. So what happens is we're conditioned by previous experience, and there's a kind of compulsion to act or sort of mental action. There's compulsion of thoughts in a particular direction. So most of that is viparka. It's what we do with that that's karmically active. So I don't know if you have this experience of something comes up in your mind and you think, wow, who thought that? What a strange thing to think. It's so against my ideals. It's so against, who I want to be and my Buddhist practice. But we've got deep conditioning, deep conditioning, which will throw up all sorts of mental habits and thoughts in the mind. So it's really important just to be honest about that and to see that there's a big difference between watching the river of thoughts go past and jumping in. And it's where we jump in, what we identify with, that really makes the difference, that we feed and entertain, that we live out and act out. That's what makes the difference. There's loads and loads of latent tendencies within the mind, loads and loads of thoughts that will give rise to perception, that are just based on not even our own previous action, but the society's conditioning and all those kind of things. But it's what we act out that we become, what we dwell on that we become. So yes, there's a river of the mind, but where we jump in, that's who we will become. That's karmically active. So rejoice when you don't jump in. Rejoice in those moments when actually a very inappropriate thought comes up in your mind, kind of sexism, gender bias, racism, national bias, stupid sort of petty little thoughts that come in, and we don't jump on them. We decide to do something different. We decide to create with ourselves and our mind something different. Yes, and we confess to letting go of the hook of compassion. In a way, that's the main confession. We need a lot of compassion to work with our mind, a lot of humility, and also, a recognition that it's work. It's not always easy. It's fascinating work, but it is work, so do go easy on yourself. And meditate only on the brilliance of the Llamas' pure awareness. That's also from Yeshe Sogyal. So meditate on the fact that, yes, there is this potential for your mind, for my mind, all of our minds to be enlightened. latent within every sphere of consciousness, is the potential for Buddhahood, irreversible creativity. And dwell on that also, and dwell on, yes, just as there's a capacity for limitless compassion, there's also there's sort of little moments of turning towards people and turning towards our own experience. And there's the capacity for limitless wisdom, and there's also those moments where we turn towards a deeper perspective, a kinder understanding of ourselves and others and the world itself. And there's a capacity for what's the other one? Contentment, yes, tranquility. And there's also those little moments of peace, little moments where we just be and relax without having to strive to kind of make anything happen for ourselves. So yes, the great bliss, the Brahma Viharas are all possible, and we're cultivating them, not underestimating the conditions we're putting in to cultivate those states of mind. Even those letting go. And I know, you've all had to let go of what you thought your ordination retreat was going to be. So just it's really rejoicing in that letting go, rejoicing in that a patient acceptance of what is. And being aware that the presence of the Buddhas is always there in a mysterious way, letting in the compassion of the Buddha, letting in the wisdom of the Buddhas. And that's what sadhana is all about. So I'll just end with how the Buddha ends with in his Two Kinds of Thought Sutta. He says, "What should be done for his disciples out of compassion by a teacher who seeks their welfare and has compassion for them, that I have done for you. There are these roots of trees, these empty huts. Meditate, bhikkhus. Do not delay, or else you will regret it later. This is our instruction to you. So there are these roots of trees and these empty huts. Meditate, watch the mind, and let it reveal its treasures."